Everyone, and welcome. I'll invite Eli and Rad to turn on their cameras.
I would.
Hello.
Hi there. Oh, there we are. All right. So great to have so many joining. We can see a few folks continue to trickle in, but I'll get us started right on time at noon. So for those of you who have not had the chance to meet, I'm Kelly Kobe. I'm a scientist at the University of Ottawa Heart Institute, where I run a meta research and open science program. And one of the hats that I wear, sort of as part of my role, is co-chair of DORA, the Declaration on Research Assessments. So I'm very interested in how responsible research assessment can be implemented across all disciplines and really across the world. And there's a lot of excitement happening in Canada specifically around responsible research assessment. So we're coming together today specifically to talk about narrative CVs and the role for these in the formation of research assessments. So I will start off just with a land acknowledgement. So as I noted, I'm an Ottawa-based scientist. So I'm calling in from Ottawa, which is the unceded traditional territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. But I recognize that today we have callers from across Canada and perhaps beyond. So if you're with us today, joining from Canada, perhaps you'd consider indicating where you're calling from in the chat and just to sort of recognize the Indigenous lands that many of us sort of work and play upon. So I will hand it over to our two esteemed speakers today. So we've got sort of a two-pack of speakers presenting on the topic of narrative CVs. And I think the fact there's two speakers may reflect, I think, the enthusiasm and excitement around this new format of research assessments that's being implemented quite top-down, actually, in Canada from our tri-agencies, but also might reflect the complexities of what this big change means for research organizations and the researchers that are needing to create or learn to create these narrative CVs and ultimately then sit on panels and learn how to adjudicate them in a way that really meets our goal of reforming research assessment. So joining us today, we have Eli Friedland from the University of Concordia and Rad Fadek from Calgary University. So I'll hand it over to you both. Looking forward to your presentation and learning from it. And then at the end, there'll be lots of time for questions and commentary amongst our participants. So I'll hand it over to you now.
Thanks a lot, Kelly, and thanks for having us today, all of you, and welcoming our presentation on navigating the shift to narrative CVs. I'm Eli Friedland. As Kelly said, I'm a senior advisor with the Pathways to Impact team at Concordia University.
And I'm Rad Fadek. I'm a research impact specialist with the Knowledge to Impact team at the University of Calgary. So as Kelly mentioned, we're sort of a two-pack today. I'm really excited to, we've been collaborating, we've been having these conversations, both Eli and myself, but also between our teams, between our institutions. We'll talk about the importance of collaboration later in navigating this shift to this new mechanism. But we just want to sort of share out some of the top findings and thoughts that we're sort of collaborating on and invite all of you into that dialogue as we sort of move through it. So this is a wonderful opportunity, and we're really excited to be here with you today.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks, Rad. So the shift to narrative CVs in the Canadian funding landscape is underway very quickly in Quebec and steadily in the rest of Canada. This means that university research offices are planning for two types of waves of support requirements from researchers. So the series of steady waves that will accompany grant opportunities in general over the coming years, and more or less a tsunami of need over the coming months. So we're focused mostly on the tsunami today, because that's what almost all of us in research offices across the country are focused on right now. How to not only meet the challenges of the narrative CV, but do so while also bringing out the opportunities it brings for changing how we view and do research. Basically, not just how to survive the tsunami, but to ride it. So today we want to address what we see as four critical and interrelated points for that right now. First, balancing the support needed by folks who are writing these for the first time with the limited resources research offices have. Second, some lessons learned from affinities and overlaps with EDI plans, but also from some important differences between these. Third, how we're learning hands-on with researchers while we're still at the outset of the shift. And fourth, we'll highlight what we see as some immediate challenges and opportunities that we can hopefully have some discussion about after the presentation. Just a caveat, we haven't planned this as a how to write one session. We in a lot of universities have recordings of previous webinars and a lot of useful tools publicly available online that do focus on the how-to though, which we'll come back to in our presentation. We're also focused for this presentation on the immediate implementation of narrative CVs for the funding agencies in Canada, rather than the broader questions about how they might be implemented further in Canadian universities. We will touch very briefly on these possibilities at the end of our presentation, though, and hopefully we can have some good discussion about that too in the second half. So, before we jump in though, just a 1 minute real quick introduction here for anyone new to this mechanism. A narrative CV is a replacement for the traditional CV, not a supplement. And we're focused specifically on the new Canadian versions, the Tri-Agency CV or the TCV, and the Fonds de Recherche du Québec CV. I'll come back to what that is very briefly for those who don't know. So that's the CV FRQ today. It's a concise, largely qualitative account in narrative form of your academic contributions, experiences, supervision, mentorship, and impact, and why they make you qualified for the research you're proposing in your application. The narrative form allows you to highlight a broad range of expertise, experience, and impact across an equally broad range of career paths and personal circumstances. So it's more than just a new CV format. It's a new mechanism in Canada for privileging quality of impact over quantity of publications and citations in research assessment. And it's a significant new enactment of DORA principles across the country. So without further ado, let's jump into riding the Canadian wave. For those of you not from Quebec, I should quickly explain, we have a separate provincial funding agency that I just mentioned called the Fonds de Recherche du Québec. That's the FRQ in CV FRQ. The FRQ has also introduced an almost identical narrative CV requirement for grant applications as the Tri-Agency, but with a much more immediate timeline. By January, all FRQ applications will require it, whereas the Tri-Agency's rollout is more gradual. So Quebec researchers in particular need resources in French and English now, and at the same time, Quebec is a litmus test for narrative CV experiences that the rest of Canada can learn from. Should note, the demand for narrative CV development support is challenging the typical support model of research offices, where we generally provide informed expertise based on experience in grant development and learning from previous researchers' needs. With narrative CVs, we're learning about those needs and about how to develop compelling CVs at the same time as the applicants. So it's of course an incredible chance to really see and develop the range of individual opportunities that are possible with this new mechanism, along with the challenges. But there's no question it stretches institutional capacities to or sometimes beyond their limits.
Yeah, so Eli, I think one thing that we've been talking about quite a bit is this sort of exploring best bang for buck formats. So the things that offer the best kinds of supports that we can offer given our capacity constraints in different ways in our institutions. And so these two different formats, the sort of asynchronous and synchronous formats, obviously there's advantages and disadvantages to both, and it's about kind of finding that sweet spot of providing both at the same time. So the asynchronous, we have recorded info sessions and webinars, which we mentioned earlier, prompt questions, FAQs, online resources and guides, things like that we can provide in a sort of unidirectional way. obviously the downside to this is that it's less of a dialogue. There's fewer learning opportunities for us in that kind of capacity building and supportive role. And then the synchronous, but it's much easier to sort of disseminate these sorts of things and have them sort of hosted permanently online. Synchronous formats obviously are much better for engagement. It's a wonderful opportunity for us to engage directly with applicants, researchers, others that are developing their TCVs or FRQCVs. Things like online office hours we're exploring here at the University of Calgary, setting aside dedicated time for that kind of one-on-one support in small chunks of blocks. Info sessions and webinars. I know there are universities and institutions out there doing full-day hands-on workshops where people bring their narrative CV drafts and write through it together and share those. Those are wonderful for that sort of collaboration also between applicants and researchers as well. So all of these have different challenges and opportunities built into them, and it's about kind of finding that sweet spot. So in the discussion period, I do hope to hear from others as to maybe where they're finding that balance and how they're managing that. One thing that remains, I think, consistent for both approaches is really this demand for collaboration. So to manage this kind of capacity strain and the sort of growing call for support, it's really kind of meeting it across these two separate areas. So intra-institutional collaboration, I think, is really important right now. We're really thinking about training the trainers and really creating that kind of front line, of folks who are well informed and can meet people a little bit closer to the ground of where they are. So that's like faculties, department heads, research facilitators, librarians, and ensuring that they're up to speed on these kind of evolving requirements and formats, and really up to speed as well on the learnings that we're getting from that direct engagement with researchers and learning from them. What are the common challenges? Where are the opportunities? How are people approaching this new format? Great examples, as people move through this, things that we're seeing. So making sure that is smoothly enabled across the institutional setting. And then inter-institutional collaborations, as you're seeing, for example, today with Eli and I, and our teams kind of collaborating and discussing this all the time. There's other things happening as well. Research Impact Canada has created a wonderful working group, Narrative CV working group, that's dedicated to sharing resources and updates on this and meeting kind of on a monthly basis. We also have resource sharing happening, Pathways from Concordia, Pathways to Impact. They have a wonderful repository there. We've created a most significant contributions statement guide that we've been, we always ensure that these things are done with Creative Commons licensing. They're open source. They're open for everyone to use, reuse, adapt to their particular institutions. We've taken extra efforts to work with others to make sure that it's bilingually available as well, so that it's available across all of Canada. So it's just an increased call to reach out, share, continue to collaborate, and discuss these learnings in this evolving space as these capacity demands kind of grow between us. So we'll transition a little bit into a space of, again, learning and thinking through this new format and these new opportunities. So we've been really seeing this kind of intersection between EDI plans and narrative CVs as this kind of emerging space. So I'm going to turn it back over to Eli to talk a little bit about the learnings in implementing EDI plans back in 2019, and I'll talk a little bit about this kind of emerging intersections between these two particular mechanisms and formats.
Yeah, thanks, Rod. Yeah, so as Rod said, I've been working on EDI and research for the past 6 years, and have been there since the beginning with the Tri-Agency and the FRQ's rollout of EDI requirements in grant applications. And we do have some lessons learned from that. One in particular that I think it's important right now that we learned from the introduction of EDI requirements is about effective use of examples for teaching and learning purposes. Templates don't work, but examples do. There was a lot of reticence to provide these for the first couple of years of EDI requirements I'm talking about, because there was a concern that applicants might just cut and paste them, i.e. abuse them in their EDI plans. But we eventually found that focusing on what's helpful to many and most researchers, sort of the useful, and not on eliminating all possibilities of the copy-paste kind of abuse, works best. And there are many fields in which researchers are immersed in teaching and learning through concrete examples, and that's how they learn best. So we've heard similar concerns about providing examples for narrative CVs, but in the balance, we propose that good example narrative CVs and extracts will be more used than abused, especially as researchers are developing them for the first time. And Rad, I'll turn over to you for the next, please.
Sure.
Thanks.
Yeah, so we're fortunate enough here at the University of Calgary to have two separate teams. The team that I work on, the Knowledge to Impact team, focused a little bit more on DORA and responsible research assessment integration, and a separate sort of EDI capacity building team. And so we've actually been sort of in parallel delivering these kind of workshops and capacity building sessions to our sort of research audiences about these two separate sort of mechanisms within applications, the EDI plans and narrative CVs. And as we've started to talk with that EDI capacity building team, we're kind of realizing, hey, there's a lot of overlap and intersections here. And we've kind of really thought through this as more than, hey, it's more than just kind of this explicit mention of EDI across the different sections of the tri-agency CV. So, the personal statement, the most significant contributions, and the mentorship and supervisory statements all mention that you can include EDI components. But I think it's more than just section overlaps. And so this is kind of a space where we're just kind of brainstorming, thinking together. I think this is about asking people to relate to themselves and their research differently than before. And so we're kind of, we're recognizing that not everyone will intuitively or implicitly know how to do this, or in many cases, in many disciplines, many people have been trained actively to not do this. So we're really kind of trying to figure out what kind of support can we offer in a collaborative way, across the EDI and narrative CV space, to make people, or to help people think differently as they approach both of those requirements in application spaces. So this is, again, just kind of an open space of conversation where we can maybe pull into the discussion a little bit later. And I'm actually going to turn it back over to Eli to just mention, again, from your learnings and experiences, some takeaways.
Yeah, thanks. So just a quick, as you said, I've been the lead at Concordia on developing support for EDI requirements in research grant applications since 2019. And while the affinities and overlaps we've been talking about are definitely important, based on my experience, I think it's also important to stress that the learning curve for narrative CVs is very likely not nearly so steep, and is almost certainly not nearly so constant as for EDI plans. For narrative CVs, at least on the writing side, it's really a question of practice and breaking habits of using easy proxies instead of describing one's own research.
Yeah, that's really helpful.
Thanks, Rod.
Yeah, so continuing on, just kind of returning back to the importance, especially in this early period of time, where we have early adopters and the first kind of applications to be using these new mechanisms and new formats, the importance of consultation and the sort of two-way teaching and learning process that's happening as we build out this capacity and support and familiarity with this sort of new mechanism and new format. And it's a commitment, I think, from all of our teams to learn through that process and be engaged really closely with our researchers and the groups of folks that are using these new and having to adapt to this new format. And we need to be engaged because we need to see, as Eli mentioned, it's a learning process for us to see both good and maybe not so good examples of these narrative CVs in play. Those consults that we're offering to folks are really important learning opportunities and experiences. And what we're looking for, I'm thinking through this as I'm a qualitative social scientist at heart. So I'm thinking of all of these engagements really through this lens of I'm looking for data saturation. So at some point, we're going to start seeing these kinds of repeated barriers or roadblocks or obstacles or challenges, maybe misconceptions that people are finding along this process of writing these and drafting these. And so we're trying to develop these kinds of ready-made fixes, these supports that address these common concerns, these frequently asked questions. And I think really the ongoing and open question for us now is how do we balance the need for these close initial engagements, especially again in this early period, with the limits on our capacity that's going to prevent us from doing this for a long period of time and an individual level for everyone who's going to have to write a tri-agency CV or an FRQ CV in the near future. So it's kind of, we need to stay engaged. We need to have this like close one-on-one engagement with some folks, but later down the line, it may not be possible. So it's kind of a question of how we do this, again, utilizing which formats of support along the way. So Eli, let's turn it back over to you to talk about how we provide support.
Sure, and this really briefly, sort of, given that narrative CVs need to be tailored to specific research projects or programs, it's particularly important for researchers to learn to develop them with adaptable processes in addition to learning instructions. Thoughtful processes will lead to a more compelling individual narrative CV the first time even, but it's also possible, for example, that a single applicant could need to adapt or write a new TCV or CV FRQ up to several times a year if they're submitting a number of applications, sometimes for different agencies and fields, and instructions only go so far when you have to be nimble. It's obviously also important to the DORA-inspired mechanism of the narrative CV that it open on to thinking differently about research, as Rad mentioned earlier. And that's by definition a process. Brad, if you want to touch on a couple of quick examples.
Yeah, so I'll just give some quick examples. This is from the latest narrative CV, tri-agency CV webinar that I delivered to the University of Calgary groups around campus. So it's also been adapted from our most significant contribution statement guide, which is available on our narrative CV website, which I'll put in the chat later just to link people there. So again, our intention has always been to provide kind of like support, not necessarily instructions, and sort of how to approach these things and break them down into smaller components so that people aren't just staring at a blank template and wondering, how do I even attack this section? And so for this sort of four-step process, I'm not necessarily going to get into the details here, but the four-step process here is how to sort of approach your most significant contribution statement. So how to build up those contributions, this kind of, describing your role and listing your activities and supporting that with evidence. And then on the right there, we have this sort of like stepwise approach. Again, this was kind of a suggested approach on how to approach the whole sort of TCV kind of out of order officially, just because that personal statement is such a summary statement. So for us, we were kind of saying, hey, you might want to, start with your most significant contributions and experiences, and then move into your supervisory and mentorship activities, and then summarize everything in your personal statement. So we're kind of trying to like give people different approaches on how to attack this thing and how to approach it. Another example from that presentation as well, we were talking about personal statements as being this challenge, and during that period of time of developing that presentation, I actually was reviewing a number of grant applications with narrative CVs, with tri-agency CVs in them, and I saw what I thought was a really great example of a personal statement. And so what I tried to do is kind of develop that out into, again, not a template per se, but the pieces of it that worked for me as somebody who was reviewing it, and trying to think about how that structure could potentially work for the other applicants and folks who are writing these narrative CVs. So again, I'm not going to go through every point here, but I was trying to give them a map of how to maybe traverse this territory. And it's in the frame of guidance rather than kind of a template. Like, don't necessarily use this verbatim and point by point, but this could help you structure that section. So that's kind of the approach that we're giving and trying to develop out as we build capacity for people. So I'm going to turn it back over to Eli to transition us to wrap up and into this discussion period.
Thanks, Rad. And yeah, that's such a great example of this two-way learning and that we're talking about. And I highly recommend that Calgary's most significant contributions statement guide for anybody working on this for that reason. But for now we'll wrap up. We still have a few minutes, but by pointing to a few immediate challenges and opportunities that are already emerging, and we think are pressing, and then a brief overview of broader implementation of narrative CVs in the research ecosystem in Canada. And then we'll open up the session to what we know is going to be an excellent discussion. So These are four interrelated items that seem pressing to us in the short term, as I said, both in terms of challenge and opportunity. And there's no real way to say which of these is primary and which of them are subsidiary. They're all both often at the same time. They're during this kind of crucible moment for the narrative CV in Canada. So just touching on each of them briefly, evaluation of narrative CVs is a pressing and multifaceted challenge. In the most immediate sense, applicants need to be able to anticipate reviewers' actual decision-making processes, not just what they're broadly encouraged to consider or not consider. And reviewers are looking to us too for guidance on how they should do this. Funding agency university engagement. We're thinking in the first place here in terms of striking a balance between stability and responsiveness to emergent concerns with narrative CV requirements. There'll obviously need to be adjustments to specific requirements, especially in the short term. But at the same time, constant change would overburden researchers, evaluators, and research support staff, not to mention tri-agency staff at the FRQ. So establishing a clear avenue for funding agency university engagement before and after adjustments should help strike the important balance. And how that, what kind of form that takes place in, I think seems worth discussing with this community of practice, Research Impact Canada, are possibilities, it seems like. The use of the journal impact factor and H-index in narrative CVs. So given how important this issue is to assessment reform and DORA as a founding principle, and seeing as we're at the very beginning of broad-scale narrative CV implementation in Canada, this seems like the perfect opportunity for reflection and discussion about whether these metrics should just be discouraged, as they are now, or actually prohibited in the TCV and the CVFRQ. And finally, resource repository as a suggestion. Many universities, as Rad has mentioned earlier, including Calgary and Concordia, are committed to making some or all of their sort of proprietary narrative CV support resources openly available, publicly available, no password needed, etc., or belonging to any particular university. One of the great advantages of the collaborations between dozens of Canadian universities on narrative CV resources through Research Impact Canada, and a big shout out to David Phipps and Sandy Chan for organizing and encouraging and coordinating that at Research Impact Canada, is that we're able to sort of leapfrog with each other. For example, when Calgary made their great most significant contributions guidelines publicly available, that freed other universities to develop more general workshops or really expansive alternate impact data source guides that in turn are publicly available, which is fantastic for everyone. But it does mean that the resources are somewhat scattered. And we think it would be helpful if researchers, evaluators, and support staff could go to a single location with links to multiple universities' specific resources rather than have to go to each university's website to explore them. And again, possible forums for this might be this group or Research Impact Canada, CARA, but for discussion. And with that, I'll pass back to Rad for some broader considerations.
Yeah, so just in the couple minutes that we have left here before we open up for discussion, I just wanted to sort of mention some of the conversations that we've been having about this, the narrative CVs as a mechanism in direct relationship with sort of DORA and responsible research assessment. So we've been kind of viewing here at the University of Calgary, we've been viewing narrative CVs a little bit as the thin edge of a wedge that's helping us to bring more DORA-aligned processes into all of our institutional routines and other opportunities that we're offering here. So what we're seeing is not only increased kind of awareness of the importance of documenting and communicating research impact differently and doing that in a more robust way and increasing interest from at all levels of the university to engage in that process and think through that process differently. But we're also seeing other sort of departments, groups, processes aligning with the tri-agencies and these requirements with the narrative CV, whether or not they're doing it from a perspective of wanting to increase responsible research assessment practices or alignment with DORA, they still want to be in alignment in general with the mechanism. And so there's just a sort of greater good that's happening in the sense that we're seeing this spread throughout the university in different ways. And it's through these kinds of things like postdoctoral awards processes, these internal seed funds or catalyst or accelerator grants. They're adopting this sort of narrative CV format and aligning it to the tri-agency CV standard. And so we're trying to provide support there as well, just to ensure that both in that adoption, so that there's an explicit sort of rationale there for why the narrative CV is this new format that's being asked of applicants, but also to educate and inform about this connection between responsible research assessment practices, DORA as a whole, our university's commitment to DORA, and then hopefully expanding that further into processes like hiring, promotion, and performance review as well, and where we might see narrative CVs and similar instruments used for applicants and others. So I think we will maybe even end a few minutes short here and turn over to discussion. Is there anything you wanted to add, Eli, at the end?
Just thank you very much for having us again, and really looking forward to discussion.
Great. Thank you both, Rad and Eli. That was really an outstanding amount of content and delivery. Really very much appreciate your expertise on this topic. So fortunately, we do have lots of time for conversation, which is, I think, really excellent to be able to have this time to sort of reflect as a group on narrative CVs broadly and on the talk and delivery in terms of the issues surfaced by Rad and Eli. So it's clear that this is sort of not a linear process, and it's going to take a lot of work and a lot of different interest holders involved to sort of get the vision of narrative CVs functioning effectively in our landscape to doing what we want them to do well done. So I'm going to open it off with some questions that I had as the conversation unfolded, but also invite folks to either add their own questions in the chat or raise their hand, and then I'll call on you and welcome you to unmute and ask your question directly. So one of the things that I wanted to sort of talk about initially was, we're gathered here today in terms of this sort of community of practice on responsible research assessment in Canada. So it's we may have others from outside of Canada joining us, but this is sort of the group that's gathering here today. And I'm wondering if you can comment on sort of any Canada-specific considerations for implementing the narrative CV. And one of the angles I was thinking about this from is in terms of like a variety of different other sort of change movements or movements that are happening in our research landscape. So you mentioned, for instance, like implementation of EDI in your talk, but of course there's other movements like implementation of open science, research impact movement, the idea of Indigenous ways of knowing being sort of incentivized and rewarded. So commenting, if you could, on sort of the Canadian perspective on narrative CVs.
Rad, do you want to jump in, or shall I?
Yeah, I mean, I can jump in really quickly. I think those are all excellent points and really, really interesting spaces to start exploring. I think, one thing that I've picked up recently, just from we actually had a visitor from the London School of Economics come over and, was talking about a lot of their sort of impact reporting coming from the REF requirements that happen, and that's a really, I think, interesting example of a very top-down, rigid kind of structured approach to asking folks to again articulate their research in a particular way, their contributions in a particular way. I think we're in that space a little bit of kind of as you mentioned at the beginning, a top-down approach, which does have some advantages. Again, as we've discussed a little bit of institutions who are signatories to DORA and who are also trying to mimic and mirror some of the requirements without even necessarily reflecting on why they're doing that. I think that all of those things are important, but I think that equally kind of, I don't want to say burdens us, but tasks of us with providing the rationale as all along the way, so that people are informed as to why this is happening and what that requirement, where it comes from, and what its intentionality is. I think there's been a couple of collective sighs in question and answer periods where it's kind of like, oh, well, you know, it's a new format, it's a new burden on me as a researcher. And so I think that that's not Canada specific per se, but I do think that it adds to that layer of kind of needing to provide that rationale and support so that people feel equipped in approaching this. Again, I think there's a lot of systems-wide transformations that are also happening at the tri-agencies that go along with this, and a lot of baggage from previous interactions with those systems that people have had. So that's a little bit of a sort of requirement, I think, on the tri-agency side to ensure hopefully a smooth transition both in the interface department so that people are not only kind of having the smoothness of adapting to a new mechanism, but also the smoothness of being able to submit that new mechanism in an easy way. But yeah, I don't know, Eli, did you have other thoughts on this?
Oh, spend the entire time in a way. It's great. It's a great question. I mean, it's one of the beautiful things about the narrative CV is it's so adaptable to particular contexts, and we have an opportunity to be highlighting these aspects of the Canadian research ecosystem as priorities. So, I mean, I think I'll just speak really briefly because I know we've got a lot of discussion, but one thing is, I think the question and then what Rad expanded on, it once again speaks to the opportunity of having funding agency, university, and not just university, this community of practice, that kind of engagement, not just back and forth, but to make this what all it can be, where we're at now.
Great. Thank you both for those reflections. I think I concur with a lot of what was said, and I think it brings in a point. I think Brad, you said earlier in the conversation around like consultation and monitoring, because I sometimes have the impression, you know, as someone who's very much in this space, when I speak to some colleagues who aren't in this space, it feels to them like the narrative CV came out of nowhere, and that there's the perception that there wasn't sort of a thoughtfulness and the sort of impetus for it isn't always clear. So I think making that clear to the community and identifying what the value add is important, as well as what we're doing to monitor and track that change as we go forward. I see I have a million more questions, but I see, Lauren, you have a question. So why don't you go ahead and share your view?
Thanks so much, both of you and Kelly, for inviting me to ask my question. I know I'm watching the chat as well, and David Phipps mentioned that one RIC member is asking applicants to internal research funding competitions to use the narrative CV. So I'm the director of research at the University of Winnipeg, and we have made it mandatory for researchers to use the tri-agency narrative CV in all of our internal research competitions. And we've had, and being a smaller university, we don't have a lot of researchers who are applying to those funding opportunities that are already requiring it. So it's like last year, I think we had like 3 applicants to the SSHRC Impact, and we had maybe 2 to Discovery Horizon. So like we don't have that kind of like vastness yet of examples. And so we really wanted to find a way to give researchers a chance to practice, but in a really low risk way. And, you know, with a, you know, just get that first one out there. And I think we also, my question kind of follows that, is that we really toyed with the idea of examples. And I think it was you, Eli, that talked about the idea of, or maybe it was you, Rod, that talked about the good example versus bad example offering to people. And that we have some examples now, but the flack that we're getting from researchers is like, how do you decide that's good, right? It's like, this hasn't gone to the tri-agency. Like, you can't tell me that reviewers at NSERC are gonna think this is good versus not good. And so I'm wondering what you think about that, especially in the context of this idea that, you know, there are guidelines for reviewers, and that's on the one hand, and then the other is what actually reviewers do. And so I'm wondering if you could share a bit more about the idea of examples and kind of how you see the evaluation part playing out when we're having these conversations with faculty.
Yeah.
And thank you so much for your presentation. This was really great.
Thank you. Do you mind if I take this on first? Because this
yes,
is
I
a
do
really
mind.
fun
No,
little
go,
anecdote that I want
yeah,
to share.
go for sure.
So when we were writing the most significant contributions statement guide that we wrote, we intentionally wanted to include examples. And so I sort of decided that I would write some of those examples. And I did, and they were bad. They were just not good. I didn't know what I was doing. So I felt like I was in that position of a researcher who was like, okay, this to me is what an example looks like. And what we did is we sent it around to our research services office, all of the team members who have been in this grant writing space for so long, and the supportive roles, in many cases probably even been reviewers themselves on many of these grants, officially or unofficially, and providing those detailed reviews and support. And I got great feedback from them saying like, no, typically when we see good ones, they look like this, they look like that. And so I went through that whole process of actually having mine pressure tested and sort of like shaped into a way where, yes, we don't necessarily have tri-agency sign off on this, but we have, more of that kind of consensus building and that experience of a pressure tested kind of example that feels like it could resonate. So it's like a best guess, but it's a hopefully informed best guess. So that was a really instructive process for me. So I feel like a little bit more confident when I tell others of like, yeah, I think it should look like this.
That's
Eli, anything to add?
Yeah. I mean, again, another question that we could spend the entire discussion on. It really points as well, just big picture, like how important the establishing real guidelines for evaluation, not just long lists of what, ever expanding lists, although those are incredibly important, but really drilling into the how in a way that approaches something standardized, so that it's predictable, so that question, well, how do you know this is how, because it feels right to you? What if it doesn't feel right to a reviewer? This kind of thing. Like I don't think that challenge can be overstated right now. And I think that this would be a really key, say, for collaboration on this. But I'll leave it at that for now. But thank you. Excellent question. And good for you for using the narrative CV internally. That's a fantastic idea.
Thanks.
Yeah,
Researchers are really upset with us right now, but they're working through it. They're figuring it out with us. It's working so far. So thanks.
I just want to echo that, Lauren. I think it's really great to do that, because on the one hand, transitioning to the narrative CV is a lot for researchers. Like we're burdened by many things, and it is another thing that takes up time. But I think it is really great because the alternative is like a mismatch between what our institutions ask of us and what our major federal funders ask from us. And so right now, as a researcher myself, personally, I often feel that I'm being asked to compete in two systems. We have this sort of new system that's coming at us from the federal funders who have signed DORA and are implementing an RSCV. But then locally, for example, I did my scientific review this year, and at an institution that has not signed DORA, and they are maybe implementing some aspects of responsible research assessment, but at the end of the day, on that scientific review, number of publications, number of first author publications, average impact factor, like these very quantitative metrics were what were surfaced. So it's like you feel like you have to do one thing for the funders and another for your institution. So I think what you're doing is creating alignment. There'll be sort of the need for researchers to adjust to what you're doing, but once that's there, the alignment I think will be really a positive thing. I wanted to also share something from my perspective when I wrote my first narrative CV. So I, obviously as the co-chair of DORA and previously a steering committee member, very involved in this space, very, very supportive of the concept of narrative CVs, but I want there to be evidence for them as well. And I think that one thing that I found just personally, it was kind of comical to share, is that when I wrote my first narrative CV, I sent it off to a mentor. He may or may not be on the call now. He will remember if this is the case. And he sent it back to me and told me it was garbage. He said he thought it was really, really just not fit for purpose, not doing what I wanted it to do. And one of the reasons is that this is a major cultural change. So what he pointed out to me, which was absolutely correct, but it's not my way of thinking as a researcher, was that there's so many things that I was doing that I hadn't captured. And these are things that have traditionally not been rewarded by the scholarly system. So they weren't even on my radar to add into the narrative CV, even though I know that they're supposed to be valued in this broader sort of narrative format, simply because, you know, I'm a product of the system. We've done things a certain way for so long. So I don't think we can understate sort of Rad's experience sounds similar as well, but the value of having second sets of eyes on the documents that we're creating.
Kelly, do you mind if I just jump in really quick
Absolutely.
and respond what you're saying? And good for you good for your mentor for being straight with you on that, because that's so important for these kind of things. But I just wanted to point out, just psychologically as well, broadly speaking, as this is experienced in its challenges for people, the opportunities can be eclipsed just very easily, just so that you're not even really, they're not on your radar, because everything on your radar is the challenges. And I think that's something that we really need as a community, as research support staff, et cetera, to be very mindful about, that as we're meeting these challenges, we're keeping our eyes on opportunities, developing the opportunities, putting them out there, keeping a focus on them. Okay, that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and if I could just add too, I think one thing that we've heard in various settings, just in general, kind of about DORA, but also about the narrative CV, is this kind of apprehension of even somebody who fully understands the format and is able to articulate really well within that format. That there's a feeling of risk. There's a feeling of like, I'm putting myself out there in this way. Are my reviewers going to understand that? Are they seeing the same things that I'm seeing? And so I think when we're thinking about success stories and building that repository up and sharing those anecdotes, around our institution or even beyond, it's also about kind of giving people the confidence of, hey, no, actually, this was a very unusual way of presenting, non-traditional outputs that was met with very high scores and a good reviewer acceptance. Because it doesn't matter how much people buy into the format, if they're not willing to take that risk and not confident about the reviewer on the other side, they're going to revert to previous ways of reporting. So
for sure. And I think from my perspective, one of the examples I'm drawn towards from other jurisdictions is, for instance, in Germany, certain institutions have basically like folks that are on the scientific review panels of grants, that their whole job is just to bring people back to the reality of a narrative evaluation. So people don't get drawn towards, the leadership board metrics that may be permeating through in the narrative CV anyway. And so when someone starts talking about how much someone has published or where they have published or the impact factor of their particular publication, they remind the group, the institution is a signatory of DORA or Kawara or whatever the change movement is, and that that's not really something that should be considered prominently in the adjudication of that individual. And I think it's such an important component, because it's so easy in these review panels. There's often a couple loud voices, and they make a decision or a statement, and if no one says anything, it's just the way things have been done, and they continue to be done like that. And people creating narrative CVs that reflect broader impacts, they're not actually adjudicated and considered fairly. So that's something I would really love to see in our country, is sort of these like grants officers or members of the committees that part of their job being on the panel is exactly this, because I think this would help with the implementation gap between sort of what we want to do and then the realities of what happens at panels. But Brad, Eli, I welcome your sort of thoughts or perspectives on whether that or other solutions could help us make that sort of leap between what we're doing and what we want to do.
Happy to jump in on that if that's
please.
good. No, I mean, this again, it's a real crux of the matter. What are people supposed to be doing? What are they doing on paper? What are the agencies relying on? And then what's actually happening? That example from the German institutions, I think that's a fantastic idea. And I mean, it almost seems impossible to do this shift without that. Without having that addition to review committees, at least for for a substantial amount of time during this transition. That's because we know from other contexts as well where evaluators are surveyed afterwards that so many people, what happens time and time again is they're like, we don't know what to do with this. I don't know how to evaluate
Exactly.
this. So the first thing I do is I go to their ORCID page, I look on Google Scholar, I check LinkedIn, and basically it means that this narrative CV experiment, and it is an experiment. This is something to acknowledge for sure. This is a big experiment. I think it's a very valuable one, but nevertheless, it's an experiment. But it just, if that's what's happening on a broad scale, then there's an intervening variable in the experiment that's skewing the results rather substantially. So yeah, for sure, like really having these processes be defined in a way for evaluators going in, and again that two-way learning as it's happening seems absolutely crucial.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm seeing lots of great comments in the chat. I do invite folks to also raise their hands and join the conversation live. One of the things that I wanted to comment on today in this session is the perception some researchers have about narrative CVs, essentially sort of pulling them towards doing things that they're not already doing. And so I just wanted to raise that because in my view, the narrative CV isn't per se trying to broaden the scope of what a researcher is doing. So we're not saying you need to change what you're doing. It's actually putting the power back in the hands of the researcher to say what they did, how they did it, and why it had impact. But there is often this, I think, misconception that, people, especially people who maybe do more fundamental research, they feel like they're being asked to sort of be all things to all people. And so have you guys encountered that in your institutions, and maybe some disciplinary distinctions between sort of the perceived value or the perceived ability to sort of fit into a narrative CV?
Yeah, I mean, again, working at that intersection between research impact and the sort of responsible research assessment space, this is also a question of, again, communicating research impact. So there are plenty of people out there who are, thinking to themselves, well, I don't care about impact, or I don't make impact. I work on, Aristotle and whatever, so like there's going to be no general public good from the work that I do. That's not why I do my work. And I think that that's always a barrier to kind of, developing out an understanding of kind of the various nonlinear ways by which our work resonates with a whole bunch of different audiences. And I think it's so common. I mean, this was like one of the things that I learned very quickly as somebody who worked in knowledge mobilization, is how limited of a view people internalize in terms of like what it means to mobilize knowledge, of like, I have to reach an audience way out there, and that's the only thing that counts for dissemination. It's like, no, you've been spending a whole bunch of time working with your colleagues to develop your ideas and come up with a better way to do your work. And that counts as knowledge mobilization. And I think that's part of that conversation about how your work moves and how it was developed and how it was, what consultations happened and the pathway that it's traveled all the way through there.
Yeah.
And that there's now a mechanism out there that can let you, in your own way, tell the story of all of those, derailments and changes and absences and presences and strangeness that was your journey along the way. And hopefully for the people where, I mean, ultimately what would be amazing is if this format actually resonated the most with those individuals, to say like, well, usually my work feels like it's a side note to a conversation about, in a big impact report for the university, they're not going to talk about somebody who just works on Aristotle on the side in a classics department or something. But now I can tell my own story in a way that could maybe resonate with reviewers who really could understand my work better. And so I think that's a potential there that could be really exciting. And I think that's what we've been trying to explore with, again, also research impact, and the frameworks that we've been developing around that too. So the narrative CV is a really cool instrument. I mean, again, I'm a qualitative social scientist, so of course I'm like really on board with this. I've been like trying to do this my whole career. So So the enthusiasm is there, and I want to share that with people where they have these non-traditional stories of their research journey.
Yeah, I love that. And I love this sort of framing that you're using of like a journey, because I think even when I reflect on my own career as a scientist, I think, I do often do things that have broader impact that lend itself very well to narrative CV, but one's career sort of cycles, right? There's times where, what I'm doing is very heavy on the research focus, and I'm not doing a lot of knowledge mobilization at that time. Then I come through and then I'm doing a whole lot of knowledge mobilization and maybe less research at that time. And the ability to sort of, say where you're at and what you're doing as part of this sort of journey is very appealing to feel like you don't have to do all things for everyone, but also not all things at all times, right? So there's different times and different focuses as we progress through our journeys. I wanted to come back to the chat. There is a comment here from Erica, and maybe we can discuss this one. So she basically was linking into my question about the Canadian context and sort of any Canadian specific considerations. So she notes there are 2 official languages, and asks, she says, many researchers with English/French as a second language, has there been any thought of the negative consequences of the narrative CV regarding language? So we know already that the narrative CV length is longer for those submitting in French. Any other thoughts or comments from either Eli or Rad in terms of the sort of multilingualism in our country and how that may be impacted or needs to be monitored and considered as we roll out narrative CVs?
If I could jump in on that, Rad, if that's good, it's a really important question in our context. It goes to resources as well, and making sure that resources we're developing, collaborating on, sharing are bilingual. But as far as the evaluation side, this is something that is of long-standing concern. And actually, I was thinking about your question on like a fundamental science and everything, which is also not happening in a vacuum, right? That's not the narrative CV. It's people who do fundamental science, humanities, feel like they're gradually pushed to the side more and more in strategic research plans, et cetera, et cetera. So this too isn't happening in a vacuum, this concern about English and French, and there has long been concerns in particular that ostensibly bilingual committees are not have members that are not in fact bilingual enough, and typically that's Anglophones who don't actually speak French, in a way that allows them to get all the detail that causes the neglect of French applications and certainly the narrative CV introduces an additional challenge in that respect, because now we don't have these things that you don't need to know another language. Like if somebody hands me a CV in Romanian, which I speak not a word of, I can get a traditional CV. I can get something from that.
Yeah.
It adds a challenge, and I find myself for a lot of these questions saying, yes, these are really excellent question, excellent challenge, and I wish I had an answer for it, but I do want to say like that's absolutely key, and I think that's something that particularly for tri-agency needs to be front of mind with committees. Sorry to be so wordy.
Thank you, Eli. And I think, unfortunately, we're going to have to sort of draw to a close here. Really, again, a big thank you to Rad and Eli for their conversation today and their presentation earlier. It's really exciting, I think, to see the narrative CVs sort of being implemented, and I think there's real value in having these discussions. And we're all facing, irrespective of sort of the role we're in, I think, shared challenges. And so having a community of practice to discuss these, I think, is really valuable. I'll say a couple of things just before closing in the last minute. I want to be respectful of your time. We're meeting again as a community of practice And I think next month in October with Catherine Graham, who will be speaking to us at that point. What we'll do following the event today is my colleague Mamoon will share the slides and the recording for anyone who would like to sort of look at those in more depth or share those within your networks. And the final thing I'll just say is that in the background, some of us are sort of scheming, coordinating to try to bring a bit more formal governance structure to our community of practice and the Canadian Reproducibility Network that we sit within more broadly. So that there's opportunities for others to sort of pick off different pieces and topics in this space and build them out as sort of working groups. So we'll get that information to you about how to get involved when it's available, but just wanted to share sort of that we're trying to formalize this community even more so. But at this point, just a big thank you all for your attendance, your time, and your interest in this topic, and we'll be in touch shortly. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kelly. Thank you, everybody. Have a good day.
Take care.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.